Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. Hi. So this paper is based, as Anka was saying, on a chapter of my doctoral thesis about Han Dynasty objects in South African museums. I approach these using an object biographies theoretical framework. In my thesis, I examined policy changes in 3 museums over a period of 100 years by investigating museum engagement with their Chinese collections. I argue that these mostly silent and hidden collections have inadvertently become signifiers for political and cultural change in South Africa. I became very excited about the prospect of the lineage, the provenance that this object had, because it told an interesting story, that of an art dealer, a culture broker who had established yet unrelated ties to South Africa, a story of the interconnected colonial forces at work in South Africa in the early 20th century, and the influence of a handful of individuals that made great contributions to what ended up in museums in South Africa. Like any object that has been around for thousands of years, this object has many stories. Unraveling object biographies, life stories of the mostly silent and inanimate, is not unlike detective work. My story shines a light on museum records, on archives, and the search for missing links. This is the story of the construction of a narrative that became entirely feasible because of circumstantial evidence. A note in an archival document, decades old, a provenance that had no supporting evidence. This is a story where the object is inseparable from the people it has encountered, the people it may not have encountered, who added layers of meaning to its journey through the work they did. A rudimentary ceramic sculpture, a figure of a male cook, kneeling with a fish on a table in front of him, is an object from the social history collections in the Iziko Museums of South Africa in Cape Town. It arrived at the museum through a bequest made by a collector, Judge Davis, in 1948. According to its museum documentation, this cook was sculpted and fired during the Han Dynasty, approximately 2,000 years ago in China, made for burial. The tomb figure is made from terracotta pottery fired at a low temperature, and it is covered in a lead-based green glaze. Terracotta is a reddish clay, evident on the back of this object, where the glaze has worn away. The lead-based green glaze has been worn down substantially on most of the cook, and there are still some areas where the glaze pooled in crevices, or where it remained thickly applied, that reveal the dark green this object would once have been. The glaze, however, now looks almost white, with a green tinge. After thousands of years in contact with soil and other elements, the green glaze becomes iridescent, milky-looking, and damaged through exposure. The fact that this object looks white in photographs becomes important later. Lead green glaze was used exclusively for burial ceramics, as the Han Chinese understood that lead was poisonous. This object is finely molded and carved. It is delicately crafted, and although it would have been cast from a mold, it received individual attention from the potter before firing, creating an expressive face, unique, perhaps attributable to the recreating of the likeness of a real person in the object. The character's face has strong features, and the head is proportionately much larger than the rest of the body. The eyebrows are raised, sitting high on the forehead and strongly emphasized. The ears are almost comically big, and the nose is pronounced, with a slight hook to its bridge. The figure seems caricatured and full of personality. The clothing is detailed, with a carved herringbone pattern on the robe that repeats on the front and the back of the figure. The sleeves of the robe are thickly rolled, and the collar distinct. The cook wears a stylized hat. A similar example has the same herringbone pattern, but with a different hat. Similar examples show stylistic trends from the Han Dynasty, which spanned over 400 years and over all of China. The hat is a feature on similar examples in other museums, that of which the example in the Musée Chanusky in Paris is stylistically closest. The table and fish are roughly modeled. They are small and received far less attention than the other areas of the object. the feet protruding from behind the figure are badly damaged, and one cannot discern whether these may have been more detailed when fired. The object has several pen markings and stickers on its base, relating to the inventory numbers, including a sticker from a former collection. Not all numbers on the base are related to archival material I have accessed. The curator mentioned that this object may have been tested using thermoluminescence testing, a process where it is possible to determine the date an object was fired by working out the half-life of the carbon particles. This is a complex and expensive scientific method of dating objects. It is not certain why this object would have been selected for dating, because it is rather clear by examining its visible properties that it comes from the Han Dynasty in China. A question of authenticity is always present when experts consider Chinese objects, and an object will get tested if there is any suspicion that it may be spurious. There is no visible evidence that the clay has been removed from the object for testing, nor does the curator have any certificate for the test, so I'm unsure why she thinks it has been tested. It is necessary here to contextualize the object within the Han Dynasty. The eco-museum cooked with the fish was created for burial during the Han Dynasty in China between 206 BC and AD to 220. This type of object is referred to as Míngqì in Chinese, which translates to object of light. The Han Dynasty is a period that many current practices can be traced back to. These luminary objects were buried as representatives of living comforts to enable the dead to continue their wealth in the afterlife. This is an ancient Chinese custom that, remarkably, used to consist of burying living human servants and living animals with nobility. Customarily, precious ritual objects were also buried. This changed during the Qin Dynasty, the period of the famous terracotta warriors, which directly preceded the Han. Cultural changes during the Qin Dynasty dictated that it was wasteful to bury resources with the dead, so they used sculptures of people and animals rather than living subjects, making use of more abundant material of fired clay instead of precious metal or jade. This practice of burying the deceased in tombs with objects was reserved for the wealthy classes. The size of the grave and the number of the objects buried would convey the social standing of the dead. For example, the object in question, this Han Dynasty cook with a fish, may have been buried in a tomb that looked something like the following. In contrast, I offer an example of a different type of Han Dynasty grave. Prisoners, slaves, or serf classes would have been buried in shallow pit graves without many objects, perhaps with an indication of who they were or how they died on a plaque. With the origins of the cook briefly contextualized in history and its materiality considered, looking from the object, I look to its current museum context. In attempting to unravel the history of an object, the historian relies primarily on documentation and information in the museum that the object finds itself in. This can be a difficult task, as the South African museums have incomplete archives and records relating to the Han Dynasty objects, not unlike international museums. As is evident from the Wits History of Art department, my department, and their publications of object biographies titled Lifelines and Lifeline Not, some older museum objects have absolutely no available information whatsoever. And untangling the net of possible leads is a lengthy process, full of dead ends and difficulties. But with a bit of luck and a lot of detective work, it is possible to uncover something of the secret lives of objects. Conducting research in Cape Town, I found that the Chinese object collections had documentation available that would be useful to me, especially the Davis collection, to which this object belongs. I was helped by a current curator, Esther Ismail, who has been at the museum and the conservator of the Davis collection for 30 years. During her employ at the museum, it has undergone several name and policy changes, which I won't discuss for the purpose of this presentation, but these changes caused the eventual disappearance of the Chinese collections from public view. Ismail has produced some work on the Davis ceramics since the 1980s, including an honors thesis, museum publications, conference papers, and an Apollo magazine article. She created detailed inventory cards for the objects during her early years as a curator. The cook is the only Han Dynasty object from the Davis bequest, but not the only Han Dynasty object in the museum collections. Information about Han Dynasty objects would likely have been limited in South Africa at the time. The curator's depth of engagement with these Han Dynasty objects is superficial, especially in comparison to later objects in the collection. The scope of the Davis collection spans 2,000 years of Chinese material culture, with a focus on the Song Dynasty, which is about 10th century. These receive far more attention in Ismail's research, possibly because they have historically been more popular collector's objects, the most valuable in monetary terms, and because they are abundantly represented in the collection. They have received the most public interest. I have deduced from documents in the Davis archive that experts consulted its objects over the years, but only one mentions the cook with the fish. In 1976, evaluation of the collection by Mr. Roger Blewett from Blewett & Sons in London was done, and all he said about the object was Han. Someone made a note in parentheses that said, like the model of the stove, same period. That refers to another Han Dynasty object from the Ezekiel collections. Blewett & Sons are integral to the story of this object. A part of the story I will explore in more detail later. A closer look at the archival documents and inventory cards from the museum will take us there. Through the work done by Ismail on the inventory cards, it was possible to investigate further. The data recorded on the inventory cards, however, reflects more of the museum environment and ideas of the curators, collectors, or dealers than necessarily providing us with empirical information about the Han object. Some observations track the physical changes experienced by the object. A conditions report claims that the head was possibly broken off and reattached. The object in the hand, probably a knife, was broken off at some point. Other comments have a bearing on our understanding of this subject matter. The sculpture is described as a seated figure, Chung Li, one of the 8 immortals. Its identification as Kwamtungwe points to a specific temporal and geographic origin. Another note identifies the provenance as the Sir Hugh Percy Lane collection, which points to a different yet specific time and place. The information mostly seems to come from a document in the archive that is titled Catalogue of Chinese Pottery and Porcelain. This document, the only one I could find in the archive relating to these claims, seems to have been created in 1948 at the time of the collection's bequest. Oh, my apologies. I spent some time researching each of these statements on the inventory card and discovered information that contradicted some of it. Investigating the claim that this male figure is a depiction of Zhongli Chuan, one of Taoism's 8 immortals, was brief. This particular figure looks nothing like visual descriptions generally employed in expressing this immortal figure in Chinese art through the ages. The Han period may also be too early for the depictions of the immortals. This is merely a cook with a fish. The museum inventory card states that this object originates from Guangdong, or Canton, a claim that seems to be based on the same 1948 Davis catalogue. There were, however, kilns producing this kind of burial ware all over China at the time. So it would seem that this is merely speculative, without any archival evidence to support it from the Ezekiel Museum. Later, outside of the museum documentation, I uncover another claim of origin for this cook with the fish. But to get there, we must first encounter the collectors and dealers. Oh, sorry. Judge R.P.B. Davis was born in 1881. He was a British expat based in Cape Town, whom collected a great many kinds of objects. This object was part of a bequest to the museum in 1948 of approximately 130 Chinese ceramic objects. His other objects were all sold in auction. Portions of this collection had previously been exhibited at the museum in 1942, before his death, and Davis had written articles for related publications. He was also present in an advisory capacity and active in the museum community, judging from correspondence in the archive. He was an active collector, but relied on companies in London to collect on his behalf due to geographical distance and the impossibility of travel and collecting during World War II. As an active collector of very specific types of Chinese objects, judging from the archive, he seemed to have kept some of his records of his collecting endeavors. The active working relationship with Davis and his records allowed the museum to construct a reasonably detailed account of this collection. His bequest of his Chinese porcelain and objects to the Ezekiel was encouraged by his friendship with Sir Percival David, who famously donated his own large, high-quality collection to the University of London, now housed in the British Museum's East Asian wing. Davis's collecting would have been inspired and informed by David, from at least 1935, when Davis attended the seminal exhibition of Chinese objects at the Royal Academy in London. They became close friends, and Davis helped with the legal documents related to the David bequest. Sir and Lady David visited Davis in Cape Town during World War II, calling the Davis collection an oasis in a desert. Davis purchased objects from some well-known and prestigious collections. His bequest also included a small amount of money, which was used for building display cases for the works. The bequest also came with instructions, as did the Percival David collection, that the work would be on permanent display in the museum, something the Ezekiel has been unable to honor since the 1990s for various reasons. Without pursuing this idea for the purpose of this presentation, it is important to mention that these types of colonial collections have become unpopular in South African museums and are deemed somewhat irrelevant in an era attempting to decolonize collections. I will explore this in greater depth in my thesis. The inventory card states that this object originates from the Sir Hugh Percy Lane collection. It does not state which dealer this object was bought from. Davis had an active association with a company that dealt in East Asian artifacts called Blewett & Sons, based in London. This company had existed since the late 1800s, and it is where many of Davis's best objects came from. There is plenty of correspondence in the Ezekiel archive between Davis and Blewett's, but there is no letter in the Ezekiel archive that relates directly to the purchase of this particular object. But in trying to find more information relating to this purchase, I imagined it would be a good place to start by finding the Blewett & Sons archive, as they facilitated a great number of his purchases. But first, I try to establish the veracity of the provenance on the inventory card, and thus enters Hugh Lane. Hugh Lane was born in Ireland in 1875. A contemporary of Davis, Lane was an art collector and a dealer with a deep interest in public access to art. He was incredibly knowledgeable about many things, well-traveled, well-respected, and a renowned dealer in contemporary paintings and sculpture. Lane was a man before his time, the first to display the work of living artists in museums in the United Kingdom. He worked from Chelsea, London, for the majority of his career. He died unexpectedly on the sinking of the HMS Lusitania in 1915, upon return from the United States. He died with many debts, which led to most of his things being sold on auction or through other dealers. There is no indication in either the Hugh Lane archive or the Ezekiel archive that Lane or Davis knew one another. It is possible to imagine that the object in question could have been sold to a London dealer in East Asian objects after Lane's death, where perhaps it changed hands a few times or lay in wait for Davis to purchase it. Lane also has some very interesting connections in South Africa. He was integral to the formation of the Johannesburg Art Gallery and curated their first collection. He also curated a collection in Cape Town. I spent weeks reading everything I could about Hugh Lane. Gillian Carman's brilliant account of the formation of the Johannesburg Art Gallery was one of the texts that I trawled through. I also looked through the Hugh Lane papers available online from the National Library of Ireland, searching for anything to connect this historical figure to Chinese objects. I found a few rather disheartening links. The only direct link between South Africa and the possibility that he had an interest in Chinese ceramics is that he he sent the founder of the Johannesburg Art Gallery, Florence Phillips, a gift of 2 green Chinese men on horseback in 1912. In the Hugh Lane papers, there are 3 mentions of anything related to Chinese culture. There is a letter about a Chinese exhibition at an embassy to which Lane was being invited. In another letter, his advice is asked concerning the value of a ceramic model of a Chinese pagoda, with no further detail about the object given. There was finally, after weeks of reading illegible handwriting, I came across one double-sided page of miscellany that lists what I could only imagine were his personal expenses, considering some of the odd things on the list. It listed things like Persian carpets and garden work. The relevant part reads, 2 Ming tile figures with blue something, 40 pounds, which got me very excited. Also on the list, 5 Chinese temple monuments, 100 pounds, and, illegible word, Chinese carpets, 250 pounds. Trying to read the handwriting was a nightmare at first, and still is. So it took ages to get through the next part, which made my heart leap into my throat. It read, white Han figure, etc., 46 pounds 10 pence. I couldn't believe my luck. It was the connection that tied all of this together. It felt like evidence that Lane actually owned a Han Dynasty object that looked white, like this cook with a fish does. Here, I have to contextualize that Han Dynasty objects were rare at the time, and not particularly popular as collectible items in the late 19th and early 20th century. Their rudimentary nature probably made them curiosities, but they weren't necessarily desired as collectibles. Very little was known about these objects or the Han culture by the Western world at the time of Hugh Lane's career. These objects had only begun to emerge from China in the late 19th century, a connection to the building of railways in China that led to the accidental uncovering of burial sites. The seminal R.L. Hobson book on Chinese art was only published the year of Lane's death. This makes the object in Hugh Lane's list seem ever more plausible to me as the one that might have ended up in the Davis collection. Based on some inventory card notes, some letters, and a terrible financial system for household goods on Lane's part, this circumstantial evidence seems to point quite neatly at links between Lane, Chinese objects, and Davis, but it didn't quite work out that way. Blewett & Sons was a respected dealership in Chinese and East Asian artifacts between the 1800s and the early 1990s. They were one of the main dealers used by Judge Davis. It is not unreasonable to speculate whether Lane's Chinese objects would have ended up sold to or through Blewett's of London, so I followed up the possibility. In an attempt to explore this, I spoke to a friend, a well-respected dealer in Chinese artifacts that used to work at Blewett & Sons in the 1980s. Progress with research never seems to be linear, and neither is this account. But for now, this is where it seems to end. I was advised to contact a man called Dominic Jelinek, who used to work at Blewett & Sons with my friend. He's also the current owner of the Blewett & Sons archive, with extensive knowledge about Blewett's, as well as the collecting history of Chinese artifacts in the West. According to Jelinek, this particular object, was actually bought straight to Blewett's from China. Bought by one of their suppliers, a Captain W.F. Collins, an engineer based in China in the 1920s, who sent interesting objects on commission to Blewett & Sons. This particular object arrived in England with a note that it came from a tomb in Luoyang, China, which, as you can see, is, well, the name of Canton is not on the map, but it's Canton would be somewhere over here. So completely different areas. Okay, that's fine. Almost finished. So the note in the Blewett's archive states that the Han period glazed figure with plentiful iridescence, the cook, from a tomb near Luoyang. I think this figure of a cook holding down a fish on a table, ready to cut it up with a handleless knife, exceedingly realistic. The face modeling is excellent. It couldn't be anything else. Jelinek wrote to me that from what he understood, this claim of origin should be taken with a pinch of salt, and that it was in all likelihood purchased by Collins like many of the other objects from the big Peking antiques market, where thousands of these kinds of objects would have been sold. This, now Beijing antiques market, still exists today. This leaves me with more questions about the object. In essence, this story, this search, and this narrative tells us a lot more about the work that happens behind the construction of an object's history. All we actually know about the object is that it's a Han Dynasty ceramic figure of a cook with a fish from China, that it passed through the dealers Blewett & Sons to Judge Davis, who donated it to the Ezekiel Museums of South Africa, where it now lies in storage. The story becomes something not only about the object itself, but about all the people it encountered and their roles in constructing its narrative. Unfortunately, it will never be understood why the provenance stated that this object came from Hugh Lane, and it is most likely that it had nothing to do with him whatsoever. It is also unlikely that I will ever be able to establish with any certainty where in China this object originates from, but it'll be fun to try. All the Han Dynasty objects in South African museums seem to have these convoluted and interesting tales. Looking from these objects, it becomes possible to unfurl an interesting narrative about collecting and the nature of collections in South African museums over time. Most interesting to me is what happens to them now and in the future, and what these objects may have come to signify over time. Thank you.